At last, here are the illustrations for the last chapter, Chapter 11 in Volume 1 of Among the Multihulls. 12 minutes. Well, Scrimshaw has been sliding through a lot of wind and water here, and with her help we've seen a lot of land and people. Let's see where she takes us next. Well, I suppose it was inevitable that I would be so very disappointed with old Providence Island. It had changed so much since I had been there and made that big deal promise in the 1950s. Again, it's located at that V-shaped jog in the coastline just to the north above the Panama Canal. So, without dwelling on the disappointment, we continued to the northwest, up around that big yellow hump of Honduras. Cabo Gracias a Dios, Cape Thank God. We were headed for what I call the crotch of the Caribbean, back to Guatemala, this time from the Atlantic side. It blew hard for us along the north coast of Honduras there, so for a while we just took the sails down and ran under bare poles. But Stephen loved to steer in this stuff. After a while we deep-reefed the main and went surfing along. Notice our old-fashioned roller reefing boom. And after a while this took us to what I call the Caribbean's birth canal. This is the mouth of Guatemala's Rio Dulce, the Great Sweet River, probably the most exotic waterway we came to know. In this wall map the river runs across the upper middle and the mouth is on the right at the Caribbean. As the sailor enters from sea, moving left now, the river winds through a jungle canyon for about 4 miles and then opens up into a long lake. Then it narrows down again for about 3 miles and then opens up into a wide lake and so on. We were much relieved to get in here just before dark and found the water to be too deep to anchor, so we tied up to the overhanging jungle and spent the night, to awake in the morning to the sound of the howler monkeys. In the trees right above us it sounded like a pack of angry German shepherds, but it was still great to get in here out of the ocean. And so beautiful. This was Tarzan jungle just bursting with life. Now that was almost 40 years ago, but I went back to the Rio Dulce in 2010, so this moving footage was taken from another boat. But I must say that I think this place is still good. When we were here in 1974 and 5, we were the only cruising boat in the whole river system for a while. Now I understand there are about 1,000 boats kept in here, most of them tucked away in the jungle. And the place is relatively hurricane-proof, so a lot of Caribbean cruisers keep their boats in here during the storm season. Now, when we were here in the 70s, we were very fortunate to be able to find a place to rent ashore. There are plenty of them now. But our place had this great palapa where we could keep the boat tied right nearby. And the place came complete with this mestizo couple, Beto and Irma, and while we were there, she gave birth to this little girl, and they named her for Joanna. And less than a mile away was the original Catamaran Island Hotel, where you could tie your boat right up to the bar. It was, and still is, I think, the greatest hangout known to man. And it was here that Russell performed the first of his proa experiments with this dugout canoe that he rigged as a single outrigger. He had quite a formative adventure with this boat on this river. And Stephen also had his own canoe here, which he planed and polished and painted to form a true dugout yacht. Now, in the 7 or 8 months it took us to sail from Guatemala to Guatemala by way of Panama, and incidentally we really got old Scrimshaw moving here. Looks like a perfect Genoa breeze. Close haul to windward about 7 or 8 knots. Not bad for a 31-footer. But while we were sailing, we had left our truck with friends and came back to collect her and travel around Central America investigating the ancient Maya culture. We visited many of the sites, enough material for another program. This is the main temple at Tikal, and from up on top you can gaze out upon 25 square miles of abandoned metropolis, now buried in jungle. Enough to make you think. And of course, while we were traveling, we collected more textiles, brought them back to the Rio Dulce, where Stephen used his canoe as a washing machine. We washed and dried them all, and as it tells in the book, we were lucky enough to smuggle them all back to the States. Well, no story of the Rio Dulce would be complete without some mention of my late great friend Mark Hassel. Do you remember this face from Chapter 6? He's the guy that built 3 of my boats, the first of which he lost in a shipwreck, and the other 2 he sailed around the world. This is the first of the other 2, a Sea Runner 37, in which Mark and his son David and his wife Bonnie set out from California going west across the Pacific in 1971. That was over a year before we headed south, and in 1974 we met up in the Rio Dulce. And this shot of us rafted up together really shows the enormous size difference between the 31 on the left and the 37. We did some cruising around together out to the Belize Keys, and I think this is probably my favorite picture of myself with Mark's boat in the background. This is what we came for. But Mark had come to stay. He loved the place, bought a little piece of land from an Indian, and whacked out a house, cut the beams from a crooked tree with a chainsaw mill, drove the vertical pilings with his boat by holding them up with the spinnaker pole and dropping them into the mud. With the help of the local Indians, he put a thatched roof on it and built this little suspension bridge over from the bank, tied his boat up in front of it, and had himself a jungle home away from home. It was half an A-frame on the dock to extend the accommodations in the boat. Nice combination. They stayed for 15 years. And during that time, Mark built his second circumnavigator. He's shown here with the model of a 62-footer that I designed for him to accommodate his workshop. And it was here that they built this boat in an area with no electricity and no running water and no road. This is Bonnie in the foreground with Marquito, the little Indian kid they adopted, and in the background is the boat on launching day. Mark would subsequently sail that vessel on a 9-year epic voyage, the only Guatemalan-flagged vessel ever to circumnavigate. There's a lot more about Mark Hassel on our website in a video entitled To Know the World. He could be a rascal, but I must say I sorely miss him. We didn't stay in Guatemala. Sometimes I wish we had, but we sailed away from there in 1975 and went up toward Belize. The indigenous people here appear to be genetically African, but they descend from the Carib Indians, the so-called Black Caribs or Garifuna people. There are some vast mangrove islands here which offer very secluded anchorages, but without the steps on our mast, I think we could have gotten lost in this maze. And the places you can go with a shoal draft cruising boat. We pulled in here, actually threw the anchor around a coconut tree. And speaking of coconuts, Belize takes the cake. These palms were something like 90 feet tall. And we learned, incidentally, that the palms are the latest in the evolutionary timeline of trees. And these things had withstood many a hurricane. Remarkable creatures. And how about a seagoing boat that you can snuggle into a place like this? Of course, there are some fine single-hull vessels around with shallow draft, but for truly splendid seakeeping properties and speed, plus unsinkable safety, combined with shallow draft, only in a multi-hull. It's irrefutable. But let's not get too objective about it. The real reasons I love my boat are much more subjective. Like sometimes she even lets me look down on the palm trees. And she's made of wood, which really matters to me, especially when she's all lit up with lantern light. You know, a lot of living has come to light within these cabins, which I hope these old photographs have revealed for you. All of this has been about that big deal promise I made to myself back in Chapter 2 at Old Providence Island. It had kept me looking up but bending down for years, and now that I was back in the same water, sailing with my family in my own boat, the burden of that promise began to fall away. There was a new kind of freedom for us in Scrimshaw. It was the freedom to do with her whatever was not promised. I felt that I was no longer encumbered by some nebulous goal. Central America had left me with a lot of contrasting impressions of reality, but I was unable to come to any real conclusions as yet. Actually, there was one conclusion that seemed clear back then. You know, when we hoist up that mainsail in the morning, no matter what we do, where we go or stay, where we end up or settle down, and no matter how our time among the multi-hulls might yet affect our future lives, we knew that we would always be merely sailing through.